Good day, we are Group Spartans and we are about to tackle Intermediate Accounting 3, Chapter 8, entitled Notes, Part 2. So let's start with related parties. They have the ability to control your financial and operating decisions. Pag sinabi natin control, you have the power over the investee or you have the power to govern. Halimbawa, someone has the ability to influence you and they can control yung financial freedom. Dapat nakadisclose yung relation nyo para walang conflict of interest. Ano nga ba yung mga example of related parties? Una na dyan yung parent and its subsidiary. Example, SM Corporation, tapos yung subsidiary niya naman ay yung SM Supermarket. Next, fellow subsidiaries with a common parent. Example, Jollibee, tapos yung subsidiary niya ay yung KFC, Red Ribbon, yun yung mga under yung Jollibee. Next, investors and its associate and the associate subsidiary. Associates exercise significant influence. Next, venturer and the joint venture subsidiary. Venture is like joint venture. Mag-start ka ng business din wala kang pwesto at may kakilala ka na may magandang lugar. Pwede kayong mag-joint venture. Yun yung joint venture. A joint venture and an associate of a common investor. Key management personnel of the reporting entity or of the reporting entity's parent. A person who has control, significant influence, or joint control over the reporting entity. Close family member of the person referred to in 6 and 7. And lastly, past employment benefit plan of the employees of either the reporting entity or an entity related to reporting entity. Sino nga ba yung mga key management personnel? Kung sinabi natin key management personnel, sila yung responsible for planning, directing, and controlling different activities na nagaganap sa entity. Specifically, sila yung mga directors, executive, and etc. Next, close family member. From the word itself, family, it includes spouse, their children, and their dependents. So, sino naman yung mga hindi related parties? Una na dyan yung two entities simply because iisa yung director nila or iisa yung management personnel nila. Next, two joint ventures simply because they are co-venturers in a joint venture. Next, financiers, trade unions, public utilities, and government agencies. And lastly, a customer, a supplier, or other businesses that the entity have a significant transactions with. So here's an illustration para mas maintindihan natin. Mr. X is a director or a key management personnel. He is related to ACO and he is also related to BCO. But ACO and BCO, just simply because they have the same director, they are not related. Now, let's move on to disclosure. So, the relationship between parents and subsidiaries. A parent-subsidiary relationship is disclosed even if there have no transactions between them during the period. So, dito, dinidisclose natin yung name ng parent. Bakit ba natin kailangan i-disclose? Para na maiwasan yung conflict of interest. Since related parties sila, pwedeng magkaroon at hindi imposible na magkaroon ng conflict of interest, which is magiging sanhi ng issues ng entity. So, need mong i-disclose yung name kahit walang transaction as long as related party. Now, let's move on to key management personnel compensation. An entity discloses the total key management personnel compensation broken down as follows. First is the short-term, next post-employment, other long-term, termination, and share-based payment. Next, ano nga ba ang related party transactions? It is a transfer of resources, services, or obligations between a reporting entity and a related party, regardless of whether a price is charged. Ano nga ba yung mga examples of transactions that are disclosed if they are with a related party? Of course, number 1, purchases of sales of goods, leases, transfer of research and development, transfer under license agreements, loans, provision of guarantees, commitments, settlement of liabilities, and participation by a parent or subsidiary in a defined benefit plan. So the following are disclosed when there are related party transactions during the periods covered by the financial statements. The first one is the nature of the related party relationship. Next is the nature of terms and amount of the transaction and outstanding balances. C. Doubtful debts recognized on the outstanding balances. So here's an example of illustration when it comes to separate and consolidated financial statements. The following relates to the transaction of ABC Company during 20X1. So here are the list of transactions. The requirement is to determine the amount of related party disclosures on ABCs. The first is to separate financial statement and second is the group's consolidated financial statement. So let's move on to the solution. For requirement A, we need to get the key management personnel compensation. Directors and officers remuneration 2 million, post-employment benefits of officers 200,000, fringe benefits 5 million, and share option granted to officers 300,000. Just add, so the answer would be 7,500,000. Next is we'll get the related party transaction and outstanding balances. So loans to directors and officers 3 million, sales to related entities 10 million. Just add 13 million. Just add the two total, 7,500,000 plus 13 million will be a total of 20,500,000. For requirement B, we are required to get the consolidated financial statements. So, for the key management personal compensation, directors and officers remuneration 2 million, post-employment benefit 200,000, fringe benefit 5 million, share option granted to officer 300,000. It is just the same as the requirement A, key management personal compensation. Ang may iba lang ay yung related party transaction and outstanding balances. So, ang magiging related party ay ang loans to directors and officers, which is 3 million. So, 7,500,000 plus 3 million is equals to 10,500,000. The 10 million sales to related entities are excluded. Bakit? Because they are intercompany transactions and outstanding balances are eliminated in the consolidated financial statements. Now, let's move on to operating segments. Ano nga ba yung operating segments? Isa yan sa component ng isang entity. Itong operating segments na to, from the word itself, operating, ibig sabihin, it engages in different business activities, from which na kung saan mag-earn sila ng revenue at kapalit nito ay mag-i-incur din sila ng expenses. Next is reportable segments. Ang isang operating segment is considered reportable kapag it is used by the management in internal reporting or results from aggregating two or more segments. Next, it is qualified under the quantitative thresholds, which I will report later, so that you'll further understand. Next is the management approach. Dito, sinasabi lang na yung decision sa operating segment is based sa management judgment. Ano nga ba yung aggregation criteria? Sinabi natin aggregation criteria, it is combining two or more segments into a single segment. Ibig sabihin, pagsasamahin mo ang A at B para maging isa sila. So, ano nga ba yung mga dapat similar economic characteristics na taglayan ng mga segments para mapagsama sila? Una na dyan yung nature of the products and services. Next is the nature of the production processes. C, the type of or class of customer of their products and services. Next is the method used to distribute their products or provide their services. And lastly, the nature of regulatory environment, if applicable. Next is the quantitative thresholds. An operating segment is reportable if it meets any of the following: revenue, profit or loss, or asset. Magiging reportable lang ang isang operating segment if na-meet niya na ang isa sa mga sumusunod. If wala naman siyang na-meet kahit isa o hindi siya qualify sa ginawang quantitative test, hindi siya magiging reportable. Para malaman kung qualify ang isang operating segments, kailangan muna silang i-test. So here's an example of a quantitative test. Entity A is preparing its year-end financial statements and has identified the following operating segments. So the requirement would be to identify the reportable segments. Para malaman nila kung alin sa mga segment na to, segments A to E, ang reportable. Kailangan i-test ang revenues, profit or loss, at assets nila kung qualify ba. So let's move to our solution. Let's start sa revenue test. Dito sa ginawang revenue test, ang mga qualify lang ay ang segment A at segment B. Para maging qualify, kailangan at least 300,000 ang revenue ng bawat segment. So, ang nakapasa lang ay ang A at B. For profit or loss test naman, imumultiply yung 10% sa may pinakamataas na amount in absolute terms. I-ignore lang ang negative value ng losses, kaya 770,000 yung ginamit kasi yun yung pinaka-malaki. Ang qualify lang dito ay ang segment A, segment B, at segment D. And lastly, sa asset naman, qualify lang ang segment A, B, at C. Kasi ang asset lang nila ang at least 4,640,000. Segment A, B, C, at D, sila lang ang reportable kasi naging qualify sila sa kahit isang test. While yung segment E lang ang not reportable kasi wala siyang na-meet kahit isa. Now, let's move on to operating segments not meeting any of the quantitative thresholds. Kapag may operating segment na hindi na-qualify sa isang kahit anong quantitative threshold, pwede pa rin naman siyang maging reportable at ma-disclose if the information would be useful to users of financial statements, and only if the management decided to. The other one, or the other option, is that i-combine lahat ng information ng operating segments na hindi qualify sa iba pang operating segments, na hindi rin qualify para makabuo ng reportable segment. but only if magkakapareha sila ng economic characteristics and shares majority of aggregation criteria. So here's an example illustration when it comes to management approach and aggregation. ABC Cost engages in 5 diversified operations, namely operations A, B, C, D, and E. Information on these segments is shown below. So there are 5 segments A to E. The list of their revenues, the list of their profit and loss, and the list of their assets. So the requirement is to identify the reportable segments. Out of these 5 segments, sino-sino ang mga reportable? Now, let's move on to the solution. Segments C and D are subjected to quantitative thresholds as shown below. Bakit C at D ang mga subjected? Ang segments A, B, at E ay reportable dahil ginagamit ito ng ABC Cost sa internal reporting. Kaya segment C at D lang ang ilist. As shown in the table, hindi na-meet ng segment C at segment D ang kahit ano sa quantitative threshold, meaning hindi sila qualified. However, sinabi rin sa problem na C and D have the same economic characteristics and share majority of aggregation criteria. Meaning, pwede silang i-combine. Maging iisa na lang sila. So, i-combine ang segment C and segment D. Since pag pinag-combine na sila, mamimit na nila yung quantitative threshold. Ibig sabihin, qualify na sila. Therefore, C and D shall be disclosed as one reportable segment. Just a quick recap, here's a summary of procedure in determining reportable segments. The first one is that the operating segments are identified based on management's internal reporting system. Second is that segments have similar economic characteristics. Third is that segments are tested under the quantitative thresholds. Next, segments are not qualified under any of the quantitative thresholds but have similar economic characteristics, are all similar in the majority of the respects, enumerated in PFRS 8. Next, the total external revenues of the identified reportable segments is tested under 75% limit on external revenues. And lastly, non-reportable segments are combined and disclosed in an all other segments category. Now let's move on to disclosures. Disclosure and general information. An entity shall disclose the following general information. The first one is the factors used to identify the entity's reportable segments, including the basis of organization. For example, whether yung isang management has chosen to organize an entity around differences in products and services, geographical areas, regulatory environments, or a combination of factors, and whether operating segments have been aggregated. Next is the judgment made by management in applying the aggregation criteria. Yung isang entity shall be disclosed kapag yung judgment na ginawa ng management sa pag-a-apply ng aggregation criteria is kasama na yung brief description of operating segments na na-aggregate na at yung economic indicators na-assess na, in determining that the aggregated operating segment share similar economic characteristics. And lastly, the types of products and services from which each reportable segment derives its revenue. So here's the information about profit or loss, assets, and liabilities. According to PFRS 8, requires an entity to report a measure of profit or loss for each reportable segment. Dito, sinasabi lang na according to PFRS 8, required ang isang entity na i-report ang measure ng profit or loss kada isang reportable segment. Next, according also to PFRS 8, required ang isang entity na i-report yung measure of total assets and liabilities kapag reportable segment, kapag yung amount ay regularly provided sa Chief Operating Decision Maker. Next, the following are required to be disclosed and the specified amounts are included in the measure of segment profit or loss reviewed by the Chief Operating Decision Maker. Revenues from external customers, revenues from transactions with other operating segments of the same city, interest revenue, interest expense, and depreciation and amortization. Information on segment assets. Dito, two of the following ay dapat i-disclose ng isang entity about each reportable segment. Kapag yung specified amount ay kasama sa pag-measure ng segment assets na ni-review or regularly provided ng Chief Operating Decision Maker, even if it is not included in the measure of segment of assets. So letter A, the amount of investment in associates and joint ventures accounted for by the equity method, and the amount of additions to non-current assets other than financial instruments. Now, let's move on to reconciliation. An entity shall provide reconciliation of all of the following. First, the total of the reportable segment's revenues to the entity's revenue. Second, the total of the reportable segment's measure of profit or loss. Next, the total of the reportable segment's asset to the entity's asset. Next, the total of the reportable segments liabilities to the entity's liabilities. And lastly, the total of the reportable segments amount for every other material item of information disclosed to the corresponding amount for the entity. The changes in internal organization. Kapag ang isang entity ay nagkaroon o gumawa ng mga changes sa structure of its internal organization na magdudulot din ng pagbabago sa reportable segments, yung information for earlier periods kasama na yung interim period shall be restated unless na yung information ay hindi available and the cost to develop it would be excessive. Now let's move on to entity-wide disclosures. Under entity-wide disclosures, there are 3. The information about products and services, which dito, yung isang entity ay dapat i-report yung revenue na galing sa external customers sa bawat isang product at services unless na kapag yung mga necessary information ay hindi available and the cost to develop it would be excessive, in which case, ito ay mali-disclose. Second is the information about geographical. Yes, alam naman natin ang ibig sabihin ng geographical, right? Dito, kapag yung revenues na galing sa external customers attributed to be an individual foreign country ay material. Those material shall be disclosed separately. Dito sa non-current assets other than financial instruments, deferred tax assets, post-employment benefit assets, and rights arising under insurance contracts. Dito naman, kapag yung asset ng isang individual foreign country ay material, those assets shall be disclosed separately. And lastly, the information about major customer. Dito, yung disclosures para sa major customer ay required kapag yung revenue na galing sa single external customer amount to 10% or more of the entity's external revenues.